Oh, good afternoon. Talafalava, everybody. Kia ora, malolele, bulaminaka. My apologies first, slightly late. I had a prior engagement, but my heart and mind was still here. But thank you for all of you for taking the time to join us in today from across the regions. On behalf of the Pacific Learning Partnership for Environmental and Social Sustainability, it's a pleasure to also welcome you back here today. As you know, this week is the final two modules of our second round of training. And so last week we had an excellent presentation by Alan Sewell of the Asian Development Bank. And now today, he will continue as our trainer for module 15. And this module is titled Environment and Social Safeguards, Provision and Compliance Management and Reporting. So just like last time, I'll read about a bit of the narrative, which inspired us to come up with this topic. The Pacific island countries are constrained with limited number of staff and expertise, including resources to carry out effective monitoring for compliance on agreed standards and conditions prescribed in a project's environmental and social management plans. So in most cases, the national EIA regulators or the local project management unit for the bank's finance projects in the countries, local and contractors do not really communicate, and often resulting in weak planning of monitoring activities and their subsequent reporting. So the roles and responsibilities at times are a bit not well understood, and particularly when it relates to the ownership for leading or supporting a particularly monitoring activity throughout the various stages of the project cycle. So today we have again with us Mr. Alan Sewell. I think is joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you, Alan, for joining in, and forward to an excellent presentation similar to last week. Everybody use the chat box or put up the hand prompt, and we'll be happy to come to you. Hopefully people use the video a bit more. We like to see a bit of interaction. Other than that, without any further ado, thank you, Alan, and Jean, thank you again for today's training. Over to you, Alan. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just upload. Can I have, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So can you please enable me?
Yes,
Thank
we just
you.
did.
Okay, so just looking for share screen. Okay. 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 Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, so this is a follow-on session. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everybody again. And this session is very much a follow-on session from the last session, where we looked at development of the environmental and social management plan through the project cycle. And we also looked at the importance of the construction environmental and social management plan, and in particular, the requirement that it must be in the bid document and the expected contents of a construction environmental and social management plan, and that the construction and environmental social management plan should be approved before construction commences. Now, I hope you have in front of you, this is just a list of abbreviations that we use throughout this, but I'll be speaking these in full, but you'll see in some of the slides we have the shortened version. So I just want to get myself out of there, right. So the objectives of this session, of this module, identifying the roles and responsibilities of parties that are associated with developing and implementing, monitoring and reporting of the ESMP and the Construction Environmental and Social Management Plan, the CESMP, throughout the project cycle. In the second part, we'll look at introduction of good practice protocols for monitoring and auditing of compliance of the ESMP or CESMP through the project cycle, including some tools and approaches. And the third part, we'll look at reporting requirements for the ESMP and CSMP. So part one, roles and responsibilities in implementing the Environmental Social Management Plan and the Construction and Environmental Social Management Plan. So there are four key parties. The first is that the four key parties are the PMU staff and consultants, secondly, the contractor, thirdly, the regulator, and fourthly, ADB. Looking at the project management unit, staff and consultants, the key role, first of all, it's really important to understand that the PMU, as a representative of the government implementing agency, has overall responsibility for the project, including the design and supervision. The team includes engineers, environmental and social safeguard staff, and consultants. So we have, in the PMU staff and consultants, we have project managers, we have environmental specialists, they may be part of the PMU staff or they could be consultants, and we have site supervision staff. And again, they may be PMU staff or consultants. And the key role of the PMU in respect of environmental safeguards is to ensure that environmental safeguards for the project are implemented effectively during construction. The second responsible party, of course, is the contractor. And that includes the contract management and all workers, and also the environmental manager or officer and health and safety manager or officer. Sometimes on small projects, there's one person who is maybe an environmental officer who is in charge of both health and safety and environmental and social. And on larger projects, this is split up into health and safety, an environmental manager perhaps, rather than an officer, someone with more authority. So it just depends really on the scope of the project. But overall, the contractor must have somebody who is responsible for implementing the construction environmental management plan. And so the key role is to prepare the construction environmental and social management plan as per the ESMP, meeting all the requirements of the approved environmental social management plan, and then implement CESMP effectively and comply with all license and permit conditions associated with the country safeguard system. That's your regulations from your EPA or the equivalent. The third party, of course, is the country safeguard system regulator, the environmental authority, EPA, DEPC, DEC, or whatever it's called in your country, and their monitoring and enforcement officers. And the key role of the regulator is to ensure that compliance with the country safeguard system and all the conditions of the statutory approvals. That includes the environmental permit or environmental license, whatever it is called in your country, the approval, all the conditions of that. Also, any other permits that are required, quarry permits, water permits that are required by the government. So the regulator is responsible for ensuring that the contractor, and then the fourth responsible party is the development party, the partner, the funding agency, World Bank, ADB, or whatever funding agency is funding the project. And that includes the project officer or project manager from the development partner side and the various safeguard specialists. And the key role of the development partner, of course, is to ensure that their agency's safeguards policies are complied with in accordance with the loan and all approved safeguard documentation. So what are the PMU's environmental safeguards main responsibilities? We're going to look at these in a little bit more detail. Well, there are three key responsibilities: planning, monitoring, and reporting. And it's really important that you in the project management unit really understand that those are the three key issues you need to be looking at. Think of PMR, planning, monitoring, and reporting. Planning, we're talking about ensuring that everything is in place before construction starts. Now, look at the project cycle above there. That means during project preparation and assessment, that's stage 2. Stage 3, during the detailed design, engineering and procurement, everything's got to be in place. There's planning involved there. And then of course, in the pre-construction phase, there's planning involved there. And we're going to go through those in the next few slides, what we're talking about. And then there's monitoring, of course, during the stage 5, during the construction itself, checking that if the project is proceeding as planned, and also recording and correcting any problems during the construction period. And then thirdly, and also very importantly, reporting, letting all stakeholders know how the project is progressing. And that is undertaken in all of the stages, all of the project preparation, detailed design, pre-construction and construction phases. So looking at the PMU responsibilities during project preparation and detailed design, this is where environmental management planning is critically important. So what are the planning activities during stage 2, during the project preparation and during the detailed design? Well, of course, there's preparation and updating of the environmental assessment and the associated ESMP that begins in the project preparation phase, and then updating occurs during the detailed design phase when the feasibility study has taken that step further, and there might be slight changes made to the feasibility study design, and that means that the EIA and ESMP have to be updated. Key role. Secondly, ensuring permits and licenses are obtained. Coordination with a regulator. This is very important during that stages 2 and 3, to have communication with your regulator, so that the PMU must be letting the regulator know what's actually going on, finding out what the requirements are for meeting getting the environmental permits or various other permits, and coordinating how that's going to work with the funder's environmental assessment requirements. And thirdly, communication with all stakeholders. That includes the community consultation plan and the grievance redress mechanism. That needs to be happening through stage 2 and stage 3. And then very importantly, particularly during stage 3, is preparing the environmental sections of tender documents, including the ESMP, any environmental design requirements. There might be, for a sewage treatment plant, there might be certain specifications based on environmental considerations. You need to check that those requirements are in the bidding documents properly. Any permit conditions, you must check that all permit conditions are included in the bidding document. And very importantly, enforcement clauses for non-compliance. These all have to go into the bidding document, so the contractor is fully aware of what the requirements are. Yes, is there a question? Okay. So there's a need for the contractor to have an environmental management as well. This needs to be put into the contract document. If you don't put it in, that the contractor is required to have an environmental manager or a dedicated environmental and social officer with certain qualifications, then he may not put it in. So this has really got to go into the bid document. Yeah. If it's not in the bid document, you'll come to site and he'll say, well, it wasn't in the bid document, I haven't budgeted for it, and there is no necessarily a person responsible. So this all needs to go into the bidding document, all part of the planning stage. Are there any questions so far? Okay, moving on. In the pre-construction phase, we're still talking about the responsibilities of the project management unit. Now, the pre-construction phase is after the contract has been awarded. And what's really important at this phase is that when the contractor prepares the CESMP, and the PMU's responsibility here, if you look on the left-hand side, environmental management planning, the PMU's environmental specialist must review and support the contractor in preparing the CESMP and then provides their approval to the contractor. Very important that the project management unit works alongside the contractor. There will often be iterations, as we talked about last week. It sometimes takes quite a while for the contractor to actually get it right, but the PMU's responsibility is to support the contractor preparing that and also to approve it. And once it's been approved, the next task for the PMU is to prepare a supervision procedures and checklists based on the approved construction, environmental and social management plan. Now look over to the right-hand side. The conditions required to complete those actions, unless it's in the contract, the contractor has appointed environmental management officer, you may not have anyone in the contractor's team who is able to do that. So it's very important that in the contract document, there is a provision there that the contractor must provide a qualified environmental person who can prepare the construction, environmental and social management plan, as well as be responsible for implementing it. And then the other thing that it should be in the bid, in the contract document, is after the award of contract, the contractor has X number of days to prepare the CESMP or the environmental social management system if it's a big project, and that happens before any work is done on site. So once it's approved, once the CESMP is approved, then the PMU then verifies the compliance of the contractor with the CESMP at a site meeting, and formally says to the project manager of the PMU, as far as environmental issues are concerned, as far as the CESMP is concerned, we think it's fine, it's approved from our point of view. That the project manager is the one who makes the decision and says, yes, the contractor can then begin his work. So then the contractor at that point is inducted to the site by the environment specialist. And as I say, the PMU informs the project manager that the contractor is now cleared to start work, and then the contractor begins work. And if you look to the right-hand side, very important clause to be in the contract, the contractor cannot take possession of the construction site until the CESMP has been approved and induction is completed satisfactorily. Unless you have that in the contract, unless you have that clause in the contract, here we just go straight ahead and start working. So it's very important to put these clauses, to make sure that these clauses are in the contract, so that you have the authority to say to the contractor, no, you can't start work until the CESMP is approved.
Hey, Alan, can I just jump in and ask for a bit more of your guidance? There's a mention of point 2, induction is completely satisfactory. Are you able to elaborate a bit more about what that means in terms of the induction, where the project manager inducts the contractor into the construction site?
Yeah, yes, sorry. Essentially, it's just a meeting where, it's approved. It's not an absolutely necessary step once the CESMP is approved, but it's actually a very good step to make sure that everyone's on board. You go to the site, you have a brief site meeting with the contractor, his environmental specialist. You go through the key issues of the CESMP, particularly those issues that you're mostly concerned about, and just ensure that the contractor and his environmental staff are fully aware of those requirements, that they're fully on board, and that you'll be watching him. It's just an extra step on top of the approval, just to reinforce the importance of the CESMP. As I say, it's not necessarily an essential thing to do. The essential thing is that the CESMP needs to be approved, but I think it's very good practice to go on site and to have a meeting and formally say to the contractor, it's approved and you can start work, as long as the PMU is the one who instructs the work to begin. Jean, do you have any comments on that? Okay.
No, sorry, I do. I just couldn't find the unmute button. Oh. Sorry. Yeah, so really how I think of it, it's like the environmental site handover, if you like. Yeah. Exactly. And it's just that last run through with the contractor, it's not only around the actual CSMP document, it's to check that, you know, you discuss the training they're going to be providing, you talk about all the communications, often the community liaison officer, which is another person that the contractor has in their team, they will also be there. So you'll be discussing all of those things that will assist in the delivery of all the environmental and social management commitments. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to we're now in the construction stage of the project cycle, stage 5. So what are the main responsibilities of the PMU during the construction phase? Well, of course, monitoring commences once the contractor begins work. If you look at that central column, and the contractor implements his CESMP, he monitors the implementation, or his environmental manager or officer monitors the implementation of the CESMP, advises and supports the contract team in taking corrective actions as they're required, and reports on the CESMP implementation. And to the left, the PMU's responsibilities during that period are monitoring and auditing of the contractor's compliance with the approved CESMP, evaluating the monitoring program, completing weekly checklists and issues, and raising any corrective action requests that are required if there is non-conformance to the CESMP. And then the conditions for those actions are the contractor must have complied with the CESMP requirements for implementing and monitoring work on site. The PMU ES has reviewed and signed off on each completed work, including any corrective actions that have arisen during the monitoring period. And once the works are completed, the sites are fully rehabilitated. Once payments, and we need to ensure that in the contract that payments may be withheld if sites have not been cleared and closed according to CESMP specifications. And it's important that the PMU's environmental supervisor is involved in that final audit, and we'll be talking about that a bit later. So the management system, the PMU environmental specialist needs to establish an organized system for environmental management and communications, inspection, monitoring, and reporting. This is the planning I keep talking about. If you get the planning right, and you have all of these plans and all of your inspection checklists and everything sorted beforehand, then the monitoring is a relatively straightforward exercise. But the environment specialist must keep evidence of all stages of the process because the development partner will audit projects according to those stages. Now, I sent you a handout. I might just, it's a handout called Third-Party Auditors Monitoring Form and Checklist, and you should have that beside you. And that it's a very useful checklist that goes through all of these activities that I've just been talking about that you as in the PMU can tick off, that these are all the planning activities that need to happen prior to construction commencing. So, you know, I urge you to use that form as a checklist for knowing what your responsibilities are, because the development partner will be using a very similar checklist to that to go through and make sure that all of those essential planning activities for preparation of implementation of the CESMP are undertaken. So before we move on to part 2, are there any
Alan, we've got a question here.
Thank you very much, Alan. And in terms of that compliance form that you forwarded, the third-party auditors, can you explain on this? Who is third auditors?
Oh, the third-party auditors. Sometimes on a big project, ADB will bring in auditors from outside on a large complex project, because what they want to make sure is that the implementation is done in accordance with international best practice. With say something like a big hydropower project, And so on a large hydropower project where they might have significant, say, biodiversity issues, working in natural habitats or critical habitats, they might want to bring in experts, independent experts from outside, just to check on that these various things are undertaken in accordance with good practice. It doesn't happen on all projects. Most sort of small projects won't need a third-party auditor, but certainly on large projects, the funders, ADB or World Bank, will often bring in particular specialists for certain activities.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on to monitoring? Okay, monitoring and auditing compliance with the ESMP. So why do we monitor? Well, the main purpose of monitoring is to verify the effectiveness of environmental protection measures in achieving the results specified in the ESMP. When monitoring indicates that environmental measures are not achieving the expected results, it provides the basis for the implementation of corrective actions. Also, monitoring is required to comply with, to ensure compliance with statutory requirements. There may be discharge standards or various permit conditions that your regulator has specified. It's important to monitor the construction activities to ensure that those statutory requirements or permit conditions are being complied with. Thirdly, visible monitoring promotes continuous environmental improvement on site by raising the environmental awareness of workers and visitors, by providing a deterrent to bad practice. Just the mere fact that you have someone, an environmental person from the PMU, walking around, on site, looking and checking and inspecting, provides a incentive in itself to promote continuous improvement by the contractor. If no one's walking around and looking at it, then the contractor's just going to go on his merry way. And if he has non-conformances, he would just take a blind eye to them and carry on, because he wants to get the work done as quickly as possible. But if you've got regular and sometimes ad hoc inspections going on, then he'll be constantly aware of these environmental issues. And so it's just a way of raising the bar, if you like, of an environmental compliance. It also provides evidence of non-compliance with performance standards, as I mentioned above, and provides reliable data in the event of any complaints. Moving on. So what does an effective monitoring plan look like? Well, in preparing a monitoring plan, it's important to ask these questions. What are we monitoring? When are we going to monitor it? Where are we going to monitor it? How? And who's responsible? It's an integral part of the ESMP and must be traceable back to the environmental assessment. The monitoring plan should be well thought out and commensurate with the risk assessment to ensure that significant environmental impacts are properly addressed. It can range from visual observation to physical measurements. And I would say for most relatively small projects that you would have in the Pacific, visual observation, or actually even for large construction projects, visual observation is one of the best, if not the best, form of monitoring. You can't argue with a photograph and visual observation. But there are times when physical monitoring, particularly noise, water quality, biodiversity, we'll be looking at those a little bit later, but there are times when physical measurements are important. But the important thing about monitoring, keep it simple. And benchmarking, it is important to benchmark the environmental conditions. In other words, establish baseline status prior to start of construction activity so that you can relate the monitoring to existing conditions. Very important when undertaking monitoring to identify trends, when identifying trends and exceedances that are explained with reference to weather and weather conditions and actual site conditions. And all monitoring should be documented, whether it's just inspection or whether it's physical monitoring. It should be documented, reviewed, and reported. There should be records of it kept every time. So just running through some of the common monitoring activities during construction: dust and air quality. Again, I would say from my personal experience, visual inspection for dust, particularly dust anyway, is the best form of monitoring. There may be certain standards that your country has for emissions, and there may be monitoring, physical monitoring required for that. But if you're just looking at if dust is your main air quality issue on a construction site, you can't beat physical observation. And actually, air quality monitoring is a very expensive exercise. So I would say limit any physical monitoring of air quality to where you need to comply with a certain standard, certain country standard from your regulator. Noise and vibration, another. Noise, very easy to monitor noise through a handheld noise monitor. In fact, I would expect that most PMUs should have one of these in-house. They're not really expensive, but they're very useful to have on site to measure noise, particularly near sensitive receptors such as schools, hospitals, residences where significant construction activity is happening. If there are complaints about noise, you can take a noise meter out, very easy handheld noise meter, and measure the noise. And if the contractor is over whatever standard he's meant to comply with during construction, then he's required to do some mitigation around that. Water quality, again, for physical water quality monitoring, unless there is some particular standard that must be met, my recommendation would always be, suspended sediment in water is one of the big issues in construction. That can be done very easily just by visual. You can see when the water's dirty, but there may be certain standards required by the country or in the conditions, the permit conditions that needs to be complied with. And in that case, then physical measurements would be required. And that would be things like suspended sediments. That might be E. coli from any discharge from a septic tank or toilet facilities, could be E. coli, could be dissolved oxygen, for example. If there are sensitive aquatic or marine environments nearby and there's discharge into those, if you have that causes drop in dissolved oxygen, and that could be dangerous to the flora, to the fauna. So there may well be a need for monitoring dissolved oxygen. But all of these, any of these kinds of physical measurements would have been identified in the environmental management plan and should have been planned for in the first place. And most of this physical monitoring will be part of the contractor's requirements. Monitoring waste from the sites, how much waste is being collected? Is it being recycled? Is it being separated? Is it being disposed of properly in accordance with what is required in the ESMP? And then health and workforce safety. Again, this is checking, using checklists to check that PPE is being used and good health and work safe practice is being undertaken. With biodiversity, here is where you really do need specialists. We can't, as environmental specialists, generalists on site, we need to have biodiversity specialists. If there is some nearby monitoring required of habitat or fauna, and in that case, experts need to be brought in. Sometimes this is required in the contract of the contractor, but my recommendation would be to keep things like biodiversity and the need for biodiversity monitoring, keep it away from the contractor. It should really be the responsibility of the PMU to get specialists in to do biodiversity monitoring rather than encumber the contractor to do that, to get specialists in. His specialty is building, is construction. Leave him to do that primarily. If there is biodiversity monitoring that needs to be done, then that should be in the hands of the PMU, and the PMU should get the relevant specialists to undertake that. And then the grievance redress mechanism needs to be monitored. And again, this is just more of a checklist, a looking at documents and checking that any complaints are being followed up as per the GRM.
Alan?
Yes.
Can you go back to monitoring, please?
Yes, sure.
I'm mindful of many of the comments that I collected through the training needs assessments and the surveys that we've done. And a lot of those comments that we received across the region focuses on development standards that their countries, that they can use. Notwithstanding, as you mentioned, that each country has their own EIA law and regulation that informs standards. So their laws tells them what sort of standards they need to look out for in certain development projects. I get that. But most of the comments are really sort of, I think, are asking for how can we develop our own standards? And if obviously that's a huge exercise, but in the absence of that, can you point us to a standard, a best practice, internationally accepted standards, or that we can reflect, that we can sort of check on, use?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have any of those for those things you've listed here?
Yes, I mean, the bog standard is the World Bank Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, and they have lots of mitigation requirements and various standards that they use. That is the benchmark for development, would be the Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, and that's what ADB uses to establish these overall standards. Then there is WHO for health standards, water quality, potable water quality, and wastewater, that sort of thing. So you've got WHO on the one hand, but the main standard that should be used, that's the first go-to place that I always go to when I'm preparing these things, is the World Bank's Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, because essentially that's international best practice is formed there, and they also give any references to any where they get their standards from. But that would be my recommendation. In the absence of any national standards, then just go to look at the World Bank website, Environmental Health and Safety Standards. Jean might have a comment on that as well.
No, I would absolutely second that. I think those EHSG are a very, very good place to start, and then the WHO standards. But just the acknowledgement that the WHO standards are very, very strict.
Yes.
So they go well beyond anything that IFC or World Bank require in their guidelines. So just with that caveat that if you're going to insist that contractors meet the WHO standard, you would probably have to provide quite a bit of defending rationale because those standards are very, very hard to meet. Sure. Thank you.
And in most cases, standards are above the national standards. And, there is a rule of thumb with some of the bank projects, finance projects, that we take on the stringent or the strictest sort of standard. But for other projects that are funded, domestically, there has, like Jean said, if you're going to impose a WHO standard on a domestic project, you have to defend why. And of course, that there's a conversation that needs to happen, as well with whoever is the boss that the EIA regulators are in. But like I said, most of folks tend to ask this question, and thank you very much, Alan and Jean. We'll put up a link to these key documents, and please feel free to consult them at your own leisure and your own reading. Thanks, Alan. I'll back to you. Let's continue. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Just a note on the EHS guidelines, the World Bank guidelines. Whenever I'm preparing an environmental assessment, and I always go to those guidelines because they provide the absolute standard, the international standard in terms of standards for environmental quality, but also they have a lot of very useful mitigation recommendations. So they're an excellent resource at all stages of environmental assessment and management. So anyway,
Yes, thank you, Alan. Thank you for the discussion on this particular topic on standards. While working in the region for last couple of years now, this is one huge gap for most of our member countries, the non-existence of standards. And so happy that now Solomon has come in and worked with SPREP to produce their liquid waste water standard. So it's a good start. And for Fiji, yes, the Environment Management Act is clear with national standards. So I think this is a good discussion, and we SPREP is working with partners on how we can assist member countries in creating national standards. Because for some my experience with some member countries, they're using WHO, they're using New Zealand, they're using Australia to existing international standards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg, Greg wants to say something. Greg?
Yep.
Thanks, Mapello. Just a really quick one. I put the link in there for the World Bank EHS guidelines. It's in the chat box for anyone. You can just click on it straight away if you want to start looking at them. As Alan says, they're very comprehensive. It's got a whole range of different types of standards. And yes, as Joppe mentioned, we have helped Solomon Islands draft up their liquid waste standards, and we're looking to do that for a couple more countries as well. And yes, a lot of countries use the old ANZAC guidelines as well for water quality, but there's a range of them, but the World Bank ones, which I've provided the link for, they're all there. You can just go straight in there while we're listening to Alan, or straight after the presentation, just copy that link and you can go straight in. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Over to you, Alan.
Okay, thanks. The key thing about monitoring, keep it simple. For the simpler, the better. For smaller, low-risk projects, use a checklist, just a standard inspection checklist. As you can see there, are trucks covered? Yes, no. Is the water spraying schedule? Yes, no. Site visits, informal checks, formal audits and inspections are at the heart of the monitoring process. Just being out there looking, inspecting and checking that things, checking visually is really, really important. And in my experience, it's more important often than actually standards. Although I don't want to decry standards because this really is a place for them, but in terms of just generally monitoring construction activities, inspection is the key. Then here we go on to inspection and audit. This is a bit my hobby horse, really. It provides inspection and audit absolutely critical for effective implementation of mitigations, and it's an essential component of the ESMP. So it provides a mechanism for key parties to regularly monitor and verify the project's environmental performance and the CESMP compliance, to identify potential problems before they occur, proactive approach, and initiate corrective action. It provides evidence of compliance with the country's safeguard system, permits, and partner policies, and the loan agreement. So whose responsibility is it? Well, all these parties have a part to play in inspection and audit. The contractor, PMU, the regulator, and the development partner. Each has responsibilities. So we'll look at these, the different tasks. Looking at the contractor's responsibilities. They should have an environmental manager or an officer who checks that the CESMP mitigation measures are implemented effectively using a checklist. He should be on site all the time. He should establish a routine system, an inspection schedule, and the frequency will depend on the nature and scale of the works, and focusing on compliance with the effectiveness of the measures identified in the approved CESMP. A daily schedule would be best, but basically focusing on not only just implementation, but the effectiveness of the implementation of the mitigation measure. And if the particular mitigation measure is not effective, then there needs to be a change, there needs to be an amendment and additional measures needed. It's important that the contractor records site inspection events in a site diary. and takes action, takes appropriate action. The action could be ranging from informal notification of non-compliance to the construction manager, or a discussion with site staff and suggestions for correcting a problem in the case of a minor non-compliance, or it could be a formal notification to the construction manager or the project director in cases of significant or persistent non-compliance. But it's important that that person keeps a record of all discussions and actions agreed to, and ensures resolution of the issue. So the environmental manager also needs to ensure that any physical monitoring that needs to be undertaken is undertaken properly. Typically, if there's water quality or noise, there may be specialists or subcontractors brought in to undertake that. The environmental manager needs to make sure he's over that in terms of supervising that the physical monitoring is undertaken correctly, and then also ensuring that the monitoring data is linked to site observations, that the monitoring data is meaningful. I mean, you can get exceedances in air quality, for example, in a site. When I was working in Hong Kong on a site as an environmental manager, Hong Kong has terrible air quality anyway, and most of it will, in certain times of the year, and we were monitoring total suspended particulates from our construction project. And there were numerous occasions when the data showed exceedance of the maximum permitted total suspended particulates, the environmental standard for the city. And on some of those occasions, there was no work actually happening on site. So this just shows sometimes you might have an exceedance, but you've got to link it with an observation, link it with what's happening on site so that you're sure that your data is meaningful. Just continue on the contractor's responsibilities. And this is, again, my hobby horse: be proactive rather than reactive. The construction environmental manager should be out there looking and being proactive, addressing potential problem before it becomes an issue. And how do you do that? Well, you can review work schedules and construction method statements, being a participant in progress meetings with the engineers, helping to identify practical solutions to actual potential problems. I mean, if you see a potential problem emerging, it's really good as an environmental manager to think, what can I do? What can I offer? What recommendation can I give to solve this problem? Rather than go and say, look, we've got a problem there. Find a solution. I see Greg's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Greg.
Thanks, Alan. Really good points. I just wanted about being proactive. I just wanted to circle back to that comment, that case study you quickly mentioned about Hong Kong and the exceedances with no practices, actually nothing happening on site. Just a reminder to some people, I mean, especially with legacy sites, you can still have exceedances when there's no activity, because if your containment design is not working properly, you'll get discharges, or if wind blows dust off the site because they haven't actually been wetting it down. So sometimes when contractors actually down tools, they also down their environmental management practices, and that's when you actually see exceedances. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So while construction's going on and they're ticking all the boxes and they're doing everything they need to, as soon as they down tools and they leave the site, you need to make sure that there's that things are being followed up.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And other ways you can just how you can be proactive, communicate with the local community regarding works progress. This is really important. Keep the community updated as to what's going on so that they can see, so that there isn't, a lot of what happens on site, contractors are very scared to talk to local community in case people get upset and it will stop the works. But actually, by letting them know in advance, discussing with them, going to them proactively, sitting down, talking to nearby communities, that actually can really help the works. It can help solve environmental problems before they really become problems. And it shows a transparency and a willingness on the part of the contractor to respect the local communities it's working in. And then using trends and monitoring data to predict and identify possible future problems. If you can see if there's certain monitoring data, water quality monitoring data, for example, you might see trends of dissolved oxygen starting to get lower, and that should raise a flag. And seeing, as you see these trends, you can say, well, we're getting triggering trends here. Maybe we need to see what's causing this before it actually goes into an exceedance. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of being proactive, trying to identify problems before they occur. And then looking at the PMU's responsibilities during inspection and audit. It's good practice is to agree a schedule to monitor and supervise the implementation of the CSMP and have regular joint site inspections with the contractor's environmental manager to verify compliance. And there you would sit down, you'd go into his office and you'd have an information review with him, have a formal sort of review of site activities, identify some of the key environmental concerns or upcoming issues in construction, inspect monitoring data that he's received, and have a look at the environmental contractors' environmental inspection records and site diary and their complaints register. All this sort of stuff can be done in a formal kind of meeting at the environmental manager's office on site. And then after that, after looking at that, have a visual inspection with the contractor and check and verify the resolution status of any previous non-compliance notices, check implementation and effectiveness of mitigation measures and any non-conformance issues, and discuss with the contractor ways to resolve these issues. So this is during the inspection, the physical walkover, if you like, and then record observations. Following the site inspection, it should be, within a day or 2 days at most, submit a brief record of the site inspection. And it should include the checklist to the contractor, the checklist that's been filled out. And it should include things like the weather conditions, the attendees at the site inspection, and including all observations, recommendations, any notices of non-conformance or corrective actions required, and including a time frame for them, and any remarks, any additional remarks, and certainly photographs of the site visit. And then these inspection records should be kept in the PMU's filing system because you'll be using them later in reporting. Very important that each time you have a formal inspection like that, that the record of that formal inspection is kept, because then this becomes a basis when you come to prepare reports. It's these regular inspections and these regular mini reports, inspection checklists that are used to compile a report, and then reporting becomes relatively straightforward. Okay, alongside routine inspections, 3 key issues also need to be followed up, and that's complaints through the grievance redress mechanism. Very important to check that any complaints are being properly followed through as per the approved grievance redress mechanism. Also, it's really important to check the resolution status of previous non-conformances, and also to undertake regular community consultations and information disclosure, as will have been documented in the community consultation plan. So these are all part of your monitoring. Regular community consultations, very important, because this needs to be reported on. And we need to be getting feedback from the communities as to how their perception of how the contractor is meeting his obligations. Now, looking at the regulators' responsibilities, what are those in terms of monitoring? Well, their main role is to ensure compliance with the consent or permit conditions, monitoring the construction as per their schedule. And as I know, a lot of the regulators have, in the Pacific particularly, they don't have a lot of staff, and sometimes when there are a number of construction projects going on, very difficult to undertake this. But it's part of their role. The PMU should advise the regulator of routine site inspections. This is a very good way where the PMU can really support the regulator by providing advising them when they are undertaking their routine inspections and inviting the regulator to come with them as a joint site inspection. This is really good because it's being proactive. It's engaging the regulator proactively, and that's really good because you can get the regulator on site. He can see if there's any non-compliance to permit conditions. So it acts as it can support you as the project management unit in enforcing compliance when you have the regulator with you during a site inspection. It's also good if there are really good things that are happening, not just negative, not just non-compliances, but when if the contractor is really doing a good job on site in terms of mitigation, it's really important that the regulator can see that as well. So it's not just the negative things, it's also the positive things. But you know, I'd encourage all PMUs to be in close contact with the regulators and keep them aware of your routine inspections and invite them along to that. The regulator also reviews the PMU inspection reports as required. There may be a requirement. He might require the PMU to send his inspection records. It doesn't happen in all countries, but that may be a requirement. It will depend on the different country. And also the regulator needs to participate in community consultations. And again, anything that the PMU is organising in terms of community consultation, be proactive about it with your regulator. Invite them along, get them involved. You know, they're a resource there to help, to give you some enforcement help, as well as being open to them and assisting them with their work as well. So moving on to the development partner's responsibilities. Well, the development partner typically undertakes periodic reviews and site visits during project implementation. He'll review the tender documents and tender preparation process as per that checklist I mentioned before, that environmental management compliance checklist. If required, he may audit a bid evaluation process and the evaluation report. The PMU and the supervision consultant and contractor have designated environmental staff. He'll check that they have the staff that they're required to have, check site conditions and compliance with the project ESMP, review the contractor's CESMP, undertake spot checks and audits, and review of monitoring reports, including any other third-party auditors' reports if they are applicable. And following the mission, the environment specialists for the development partner will typically prepare a, sorry about that. The report will advise on the compliance of procedures and processes and documentation regarding the tender and bid evaluation process, and will describe how these have been translated into actual environmental performance on site. So key deficiencies will be noted, along with recommendations for corrective actions. So now looking at inspection, monitoring and auditing tools. And I say use standard forms, including a rating for each area. And I've given you some examples here. I've given you a number of examples, a mitigation compliance inspection monitoring form, and notes on how to fill one of those out. Now, this is just an example of what a form will look like, and each person will have their own way of preparing an inspection monitoring form. But this, and as I say, this isn't the last word on monitoring or inspection, and I've seen some really good ones, really elaborate ones, and some simple good ones that are quite different to mine. But essentially have a tool, have a standard form that you use, including a rating for each area of inspection, monthly summaries of non-compliance, incident notices, resolution status, and then submit audit reports to the contractor. So I've given you some examples there that you're most welcome to use, and don't feel constrained by those. Develop your own system that works for you, but these are just some examples of what I have used in the past. The most useful monitoring instrument of all. The camera doesn't lie most of the time. I mean, you can take a photograph and it tells the story. So use it as much as you can. It's always important to carry a camera on site during any site inspection. And these become evidence. And it's important to have a date and time settings on the camera so that it's very clear and documented. In summary, a monitoring program should be based on the risk assessment. You know, if it's low risk, then the monitoring doesn't have to be quite so intense. But if there are high risk issues, then monitoring needs to be closely handled. Monitoring ranges from simple visual inspection to complex analysis, depending on the risks. Use recognized best practice monitoring and analytical methods. And that's another thing. If you are doing physical monitoring, unless you're using international best practice or the proper monitoring techniques, you know, that are internationally recognized, then the monitoring data can always be questioned. So it's important, if you are going to use physical monitoring in any, like water quality monitoring, air quality monitoring, that sort of thing, you use methods that are widely accepted internationally. Otherwise, the data can be quite meaningless. So again, you know, and often these physical monitoring, it's expensive. So use it sparingly and when necessary. And when you do use it, make sure you use proper methods. And again, I'll refer you to the World Bank's Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, and they'll give you outline of what the monitoring methods and techniques should be for various types of physical monitoring. And monitoring should be linked with inspection and audit, and always carry a camera on site. So before we move on to reporting requirements, any queries, any comments on that section, part 2, inspection and audit? Okay, moving on to reporting requirements. The objective of this module is to outline what is expected from the supervision. Sorry.
We've got a comment on the chat box.
Oh, sorry, I'm not looking at the chat box.
Sorry, that's okay. That's my job.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
It says, if there is capacity in-house in the PMU to take engineering design, feasibility investigations, develop the ESIA and ESMP, would it be okay to only engage a contractor, the supervision consultants, and the third-party auditors for the purpose of construction only?
Yeah, I mean, if there is, I mean, if you've got expertise, environmental expertise in the PMU, you may not need to have a consultant doing that. I mean, the whole point of getting a consultant in to do environmental inspection, monitoring, or whatever, is if the PMU does not have that in-house capability. So if there is in-house capability, then yes, go ahead and do it and save money rather than get an external consultant to do it. But again, as I say, if you are doing physical monitoring, it's important to make sure that you've got appropriate laboratory resources on hand or various techniques on hand. Some of this equipment is very expensive, and that's typically why we get sub-consultants in to do that. But if you have expertise in-house, that's great.
Alan, I'm reading this a bit differently. Silas, if you can come online. You're suggesting that, you know, I might be wrong, so please feel free to correct me, but it seems that you're asking that if you have ESIA and all the other expertise in the PMU, then the only thing for us to do now is to procure a contractor and supervision consultants and others. But the contractor must also have their own environment specialist on board to develop the CESMP. If it is a construction project, a large-scale construction project, the contractor must have their own folks there. They must demonstrate on paper the talent that they're about to hire, to develop the CEMP and to monitor the CEMP along the full contract. So they're not, and the PMU, the folks in the PMU, their job is to independently review what the contractor is reporting on. So I hope that is a distinction that needs to be made here.
Yeah.
Is that all right, Silas? Do you want to come online if you don't mind? It's a very good comment. That's why I'm picking it out. Can you come online, Silas? No. Okay, well, all right. Anyways, then let the comment remain there. Sorry, Alan. That's my take on.
It's a very good comment, and yes, absolutely. What is really important, and I come back to this again, you've got to put it into the contract that the contractor must employ or have as part of his contracting team an environmental manager with XYZ qualifications and experience who is able to prepare the CESMP and oversee its implementation. It's important that you put that into the bid and contract document. Then the contractor knows he has to get that person, knows it's going to cost him some money to get that qualified person, and that's the only way you're going to ensure that he's going to be able to do that. So it comes right back to making sure that these provisions are put into the contract document. If you don't have them in there, the contractor will just say, there was nothing in the contract that said I had to have an environmental manager, so I'm not doing that, So again, comes back to that, and be very careful or be very vigilant when preparing the bidding document that you have these provisions in there that the contractor must have appropriately qualified and experienced staff to prepare the CESMP and then to oversee its implementation. Okay, reporting requirements. What are the typical reporting? Well, typically reporting on environmental and social management, the contractors will typically prepare their monthly progress reports to report on CESMP. It'll be a typical progress report reporting on construction progress, but there should always be a section in there in the monthly report on implementation of the CESMP, including the grievance redress mechanism. And that should include all various daily and weekly checklists that have been prepared, any issues that have been raised during that month, any corrective action requests that have been issued, any outstanding issues that have not been fully addressed. So all that needs to be summarized by the contractor in their monthly report. Similarly, the PMU typically will provide quarterly progress reports to the funder, the development partner, and there should be include a section on safeguards. And again, this should summarize all the various inspection records that have been happening on hopefully a weekly basis and summarize what has actually been going on in site in terms of compliance with or conformance with the CESMP and any outstanding issues that have not been addressed. The development partner typically requires sometimes a quarterly, but certainly in terms of ADB, a 6-monthly environmental monitoring report. Again, this needs to be prepared by the PMU, summarizing the environmental performance of the contractor during the previous 6 months. The development partner, PMU and contractor, and the design and supervision consultants may agree to some other requirements. I'm just outlining these that are typical ones for a typical construction project, a typical bank-funded construction project, but there could be other reports, ad hoc reports that are required. Audit inspection reports should also be prepared and filed as we outlined above. Reporting tips, focus on monitoring and inspection and results. Don't just paste loads of text. You don't need to write a book. We just want to focus on what we're doing here. It's reporting on compliance of the CESMP environmental compliance, environmental and social compliance of the contractor. So keep it relevant. Use tables and photos as much as possible. And then include completed checklists as annexes and proof that these need to be just summarized in the text, but include all your checklists as an annex. But again, keep it relevant. They don't need to be big, long, thick books. Keep it relevant. ADB, anyone who's reading them don't want to waste their time reading a lot of irrelevant details. So keep it concise and to the point, that reporting actual performance on site. If there is, typically on a site, there might be an incident or a major non-compliance. An incident may be a typhoon or a cyclone may have gone through, and there might have been a landslide or some major issue, a major spill or something on site. In that particular case, you need to fill out an incident notice. And in this particular case, you would have a summary of the incident, any statistics, any monitoring statistics, or the scale of the incident. It could be information on the length of say, the impacted river, the scale of any fish kill, for example, the area of on-site polluted soil, and so forth. Enough information should be provided to give an idea of the significance of the incident, and then describe the incident. What occurred? How did it occur? Who was involved in it? And then what control action was undertaken at the time? Were spill kits used, for example? Were diversion trenches put up? Were there temporary means to ameliorate the consequences of the incident? And then evaluate the consequence, both immediate and long term, with special attention given to impacts that extend beyond the site. And any lessons learned, very importantly, what lessons have you learned from this incident, and any recommendations for corrective actions to prevent future incidents? And just some notes here on the semi-annual report, and this is a typical ADB semi-annual report. I'm not as familiar with World Bank's requirements, but ADB requires on their projects a 6-monthly report on implementation of environmental safeguards, and this should include an introduction outlining the construction activities and progress in the past 6 months, any changes to the environmental management team. It should have an environmental monitoring section where it summarizes data, explains any exceedances or non-conformances, any recommendations for preventing future exceedances, and then it should have a section on environmental management, delivery of the CESMP actions and items, inspections and audits that have undertaken during that 6-month period, non-compliance notices that have been issued, corrective actions plans that have been addressed or not addressed, consultations with the community that have been undertaken over that 6-month period. And the actual minutes of those consultations should be annexed, but just a summary of those consultations in the text itself. Any complaints that are received, and any training and capacity building activities that have been undertaken during that period. And then finally, there's what's really important when construction is completed, that there is a final audit report, and it should be a requirement that the final audit report is completed, required for final payment of penalties. So this report needs to be completed and signed off. So at the end of the project, so that there are no significant residual environmental impacts following completion of construction, and that all temporary works have been cleared or passed on to another responsible party. And the report is required for final payment and or return of any environmental bond, for example. Sometimes environmental bonds are required by the contractor at the beginning of the site to ensure against any legacy issues at the end of construction. The final audit report should focus on environmental condition of a site following the completion of construction and handover of the site to the project owner. and that means disposal of scrap, residual materials, machinery. I know my experience in the Solomons on one particular project we were doing a few years ago, and went to the site visit and heard from the community that in a previous roads project, the contractor had left all his big machinery just sitting there because it was too expensive to take it off the island and take it away. And then this becomes just a hazard for the community, or they don't know what to do with it. And a safety hazard as well. So it's things like that the final payments to the contractor should not be made until everything is removed from site and it's been properly rehabilitated or remediated. And it's very important to withhold any payment before that happens. Until that happens, sorry. In summary, for reporting, use standard formats and templates and checklists wherever possible. Keep it concise, keep it to the point, keep it relevant. Reports should be clear and concise. Use of photos, graphs, tables rather than pages of text. No one wants to read a book about environmental compliance. We want to see what's actually happening, what hasn't been happening, what's been good, and what should be happening in the future. Reports should be oriented towards the intended readers, that is the public, because these reports will be available to the public. So that is the end of my presentation today. If there are any comments on this, please, or anything, whether on this section or any other section, if you have any comments or queries, discussion. Thanks,
Alan. Let's go to the floor and see that we're a bit shy. There's a bit of a shy bunch out there. Trying to get them, to stimulate them to get online, or even I think a lot. You really shared a lot of really critical advice along in terms of the topic, the monitoring, the roles and responsibilities, and hopefully folks out there will have questions or even just make observations of what you are encountering in your work and share with us. We're happy to share with you our experience. So just open out to the floor. Do I have anyone? I've got one from Sally Pizza from the Solomon Islands. Who is responsible to produce the semi-annual report?
Oh, that's the PMU's responsibility. And whether the PMU does it themselves as staff or whether they delegate that to the supervision consultant, ultimately it is the responsibility of the project management unit. It's the responsibility of the country to provide that to ADB. Now, how they go about it, whether they use their staff or consultant, it's entirely up to them. But it will be in the loan documentation that is required from the government. So ultimately, it's PMU's responsibility.
Yeah, usually those big reports are those mandated or required reports are usually handled between the donor, the development partner, and the national government, which the PMU sits in. So those are the higher reportings that are done at that level. At the project level, then you've got the PMU and all the others that are involved in the PMU, including contractors and builders and other consultants, that they can feed their inputs into the reports, and then those inputs go up higher, and they form those big reports. So Alan has said that is a responsibility of the PMU. Thank you very much, Alan. Any other question out there? Any observation? I've got a comment here from Jope.
Thank you. I have a few, but I'll start with my first one first, and then I'll allow our listeners to join in if they have any other observations. Yes, thank you, Helen. I'll go along with the comment raised by Mepel. Your presentation today is really good, and I really like it, and thank you for that. And yes, I look at the presentation, and you are basing it from ADB project perspective.
Yes.
And one thing that really interests me in when you talk about the parties to a particular project. And in my experience working in Fiji and here in the region for projects outside ADB and World Bank for individual developments, one important party that we always consider and we always must look after for is the resource owners. By that, I mean the registered landowners in which the development which will be taking place.
Yes.
In my experience in Fiji, Ellen, there are some strong landowners in Fiji where they form a committee of their own to monitor operation of the government as a regulator, to monitor the developer and those other parties that fall in that particular project on their own piece of land. So my point is the resource or the registered landowners. So I just want to contribute in that, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful, and that's really good. And yes, they do, and we also find that I've also found that in Vanuatu too. We have consultation, community liaison officers and people like that that work on behalf of the landowners in project development, and very important people to be communicating with on a regular basis. So yes, thank you for that.
Thanks, Alan. Anybody else with a question out there? I really want to invite you all to use this opportunity. There are opportunities after this that you can continue the conversation. You can through the PNEA, the Talanoa forum, which you can post your questions. And we've got Alan as a member in there that he can respond to your questions. But it would be great to have anybody else with some burning last questions or comments or observations. Happy to take them.
What's a ballpark figure for preparing such reports if you're following the standard? What kind of cost are we looking at?
Oh gosh, it's it's a difficult one. Preparing, I'm just thinking like preparing I mean, it should be part of it. I'm just thinking like, for example, the semi-annual safeguards report that a consultant might prepare on behalf of the PMU. Frankly, it might be 2 days work, you know, to prepare that, given that if records have been provided or there's been monitoring records, compilation of monitoring records. So, you know, you might have 2 days of an international consultant's time to prepare a 6-monthly report, or it might be a week, you know. So, yeah, I mean, for example, for myself, it would take me, you know, a couple of days, if at the most, if all the information was available. The key thing is making sure that all the relevant monitoring and inspection information is provided. Once that's been provided, it's a fairly easy process. And what I was trying to say, actually, through this presentation was that, you know, if you do your weekly site inspections and your regular inspections with the contractor, and then your monthly reports, and you're filing all of these checklists and small reports, and it's all being filed and compiled, including, you know, consultation meetings, minutes of meetings, all of that stuff. When it comes to preparing a report like the semi-annual report, it's really just a matter of summarizing all of those small checklists and reports that you've gathered together. So it's not a big issue, but it is a big issue if you haven't been routinely undertaking those weekly inspections or weekly audits or whatever monitoring regime you've had going. If you're doing it regularly and filing those on a regular basis, then preparing the 6-monthly report is not a big issue. But certainly if that hasn't been done, then it takes time to go back, and it's quite an arduous process. So what I've been trying to say here is, if you're doing your small inspection, your weekly monitoring and compiling those records and keeping up to date with those, then these large reports are not big issues at all.
Yeah, so usually they have terms of references for every tender, and usually you'll specify the number of days. So I like the way Alan approached in terms of his response, looking at the number of days, and so that would determine the sort of the budget. And you just look at the terms of reference, and you'll see what that is. The PMU will specify it, and then the budget will be made available, and then you're free to compete for that contract. So. And like I said, all of these reports are different in, for example, in ESIA and ESB, they're different as well. So same advice then, refer to the terms of reference, and you can actually feel the complexity and weight of the work by the amount of content that the terms of reference has. So. Yes. And those are sort of fixed, sort of the same information provided out in the open market for people to compete on. So is there any other question from the floor? I mean, Yassi, do you have any question, Datu? Anybody from the floor before we finished?
I think, sorry, I just want to add that that's a really good approach, because with COVID, that sort of limited the travel of, international consultants and whatnot to the island. So I think in your response, you paved a really good approach on how things could be done moving forward in terms of planning these things out for any project, as long as the end country is providing all the relevant data, whereby somebody could come in like on an international level and just pull that together for reporting purpose. I think it can sort of, I was just looking at another way of overcoming such things with COVID in mind.
Sure.
Travel.
Yeah, thank you.
Your turn.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that comment. And Alan, you raised one very important point in the later part of your presentation, and that is on environment bond. And this is one area that most of the Pacific Island country members would like to know more about. The question is there any sort of standard formula or guideline on how we can help countries out in calculating what is a required environment bond for significant developments?
That's a very good question, which I can't really answer, I'm afraid. I've had very little experience of an environmental bond, but I bring that in because I heard that from a World Bank staff member, and it is used in World Bank projects. Certainly in South America, they have environmental bonds. In terms of how much, I mean, I would say it would be in the millions of dollars. That's all I can say, but it's something that needs to be put into, the contract document, and it needs to be sort of discussed and agreed amongst the funders and people who are developing those documents. But I think it's a very good approach. If the contractor is aware that there's a significant amount of money that he could miss out on if he is not compliant, then that is a very good carrot to ensure that he is compliant, and he leaves the site in good condition. But I can't give you any more details than that. I haven't had a lot of experience in it, but it's certainly a precedent that has been undertaken elsewhere and been successful.
Thank you, Alan. And if I may, if you have contacts of people who can help us out with this particular item, we'll be happy to get the contacts, and we'll communicate with them more and share it with our participants today. And
okay,
yes, I would like to ask another one, Mr. Moderator.
Go for it.
Thank you. And yes, you answered a bit of, you shared this in your presentation today, and the scenario I would like to raise, Alan, and I seek your guidance on is when we look at the PMU and monitoring the work of the contractor, and even if there is a breach by the contractor, how is the contractor going to be penalized? That's one scenario. But from the other angle, if the regulator is carrying out its own monitoring or inspection without the PMU and find a non-compliance or a breach, who will be responsible for that particular breach? Will it be both the PMU and the contractor? So that is the scenario I would like some discussion on. Hope you understand where I'm coming from.
That second point is a tricky one. Who's responsible for any non-compliance, whether it's the PMU or whether it's the contractor? Now that's a tricky one. I can't really answer that. It's something that would need discussion between, earlier discussion, advanced discussion between the contractor and between the regulator and the PMU to determine that. And the contractor will be doing everything in his power to make sure that it's not him. That's all I can say. Your first point, I'll just go back to your first point about how penalised. Again, there are ways that, you can write things into a contract document whereby non-compliance to environmental mitigation or non-compliance to the CESMP will incur penalties, and you can specify those penalties in the contract. You can say things like if, for example, there is a significant non-conformance or there is a non-compliance whereby, say, for example, there was a major oil spill and it got into the groundwater. There was an oil spill on site, and then it seeped into either the groundwater or the river water, and you've said to the contractor, you've got to clean that up. And if he doesn't clean it up, what happens next? How is, there needs to be some provision whereby in the contract you say, if there is a major non-compliance and the contractor does not respond to a corrective action request, then the employer has the right to get another contractor in to clean up the mess and then back charge the contractor plus 15% or something like that. So you can put those kinds of penalties into your contract.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alan.
Okay.
Any question? Anybody? Any observation? No, I don't. I think we've also passed the mark, Alan. So I think just that just leaves me with my usual spiel about please access every information on PNEA. We will upload the presentation today, and you can start the Talanoa sessions on any of the topics that you may have missed today or you haven't had the chance to ask. You can ask them on the Talanoa, and we can get a discussion going. The evaluation, my colleague Jill will send the evaluation survey monkey, just like before. Please do complete them so you can get your training certificates. And tomorrow is our final module for the second round of training under the PLP. This is for module 16, which is the titled Preventing Gender-Based Violence, Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and Sexual Harassment in a Project Environment. And that tomorrow's module will be led by the World Bank consultant, Ms. Tessa Walsh, who will be joined in together with Rachel Marburg. So, I hope you were able to make it, but please do join me now in giving Alan a great big thanks for last week and this week or the week before's presentation. Alan, really enjoyed it, mate. Seriously, I think you spoke very clear and you gave excellent advice, not just written, but also verbalize your advice. And that really makes sense to many of our folks out there who's encountering these sort of scenarios in their workplace. So, I really want to thank you for a well-prepared presentation. and delivered one. So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank through you, Jean Williams from the ADP, for making both your time available for the PLP training. So thank you very much, Alan, and we wish you all the best. Hopefully if there's a third round of training next year, we can tap again on your big broad shoulders and your excellent mind to share, to share with the community of practitioners that are the PLP out there. So thank you again, Alan. Thanks everybody. Same time, same place tomorrow. Hope we'll see you then.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Alan and team. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.